how our job costing solution, right, really aggregates and pulls data from various and different transactions in NetSuite that ultimately streamline the creation of what's most important, especially for those project managers, project supervisors, people really working, say, at the executive and management level, looking at job cost reports, budget versus actuals, and just the ability for them to be able to report, on project profitability and do things like quick pulse checks on any given project at any given time. And so just want to highlight here, with our job costing standard module, we have built-in 8 job costing metrics, and you can see them defined here. Again, the intention behind this is really to give someone the solution and the ability to land and expand. We understand, based off of working with over 50 plus construction and construction-like companies, that there are specific metrics that they absolutely require and need to be able to compute and report on their specific projects. Everything from different revenue and different cost inputs, right? And so what you're seeing here are the 8 metrics that come out of the box, pre-configured, ready to rock and roll. Okay, so everything from tracking your different revenue inputs, and so your original budgeted revenue, your change order revenue, which is very, very common in the space. So if you're a GC, oftentimes what you'll see is a very heavy change order management process where not only are they dealing with change orders from their subs, but they're also managing change orders from their owner's perspective, right? And so change order management is a huge need, not only in the GC world, but also when you're dealing with subcontractors, right? But when you're a subcontractor or a specialty trade, you're more focused on the change orders that you typically see coming down from your GC. And maybe oftentimes directly from your client as well, if that's the relationship you have with that client. But ultimately, change order is absolutely a critical piece and part of our construction job costing standard bundle that we have for the emerging space. Another important metric that we often see is tracking your actual build to date, right? And so throughout your project lifecycle, again, depending on ultimately how a company is billing their customers or billing their GCs, again, depending on the relationship, right? What you'll see is sometimes they'll do fixed bid milestone billing, right? So based off a specific milestone or project task or time frame within the project, they'll charge X amount for that specific time, right? So let's say for the months of January through March, they're going to charge $100,000 for that portion of the project. And they continue on that schedule throughout that project lifecycle. What we often see is also percent complete type billing. And this is very different than what you see standard coming out of NetSuite with their advanced project module, where the advanced project module in NetSuite only allows you to charge based off of labor hours, where percent complete is based off of percent cost incurred. What does that mean? Well, when you think about construction, it's more than just labor. It's labor, it's equipment, it's materials, it's subcontractors, right? You could have overhead, sort of these miscellaneous charges that ultimately compute and aggregate to give you what we call your percent cost incurred, right? And you're charging for that percent cost incurred on an incremental basis. Usually what we'll see is on a monthly basis. So this is very important, especially when you start thinking about WIP and how that impacts your WIP and being able to track that on a periodic basis. And so that's just one half of the equation is tracking your revenue. But the other half of the equation is then tracking your costs. And I can't stress this enough. This is the most critical piece when we're talking to construction and project-based companies, right? They need to understand their costs and they need to understand it at different levels. Different companies want to track it at a very summarized level, at a project level, which is what you're seeing right here. But you can also track it at a periodic level, right? You can track it at a work code level, at a cost type level, and at the periodic level. So these different dimensions ultimately give different audiences and different users visibility and control over their projects at a specific point in time, right? And so some costs to call out here, right? You're going to want to understand and sort of set a baseline for your original budgeted costs. So when that first project started and when that first contract was signed, what was our original budgeted costs? And it's important for them to track that because that's going to be their baseline that they work off moving forward for any additional cost changes, right? Where do those cost changes come from? What scope or what phase did that cost change occur in. They want to understand these things because when it comes to their next project that's very similar, they want to be able to report on that, understand why the cost changes occurred, and then improve their estimation process moving forward. So it's very, very critical for them to understand that. And then oftentimes what you'll see throughout the construction process is, they're ordering materials, they're working with subcontractors, they're leasing out equipment. Ultimately, what we bucket this as is called our committed costs, right? So you've committed to purchase these specific services or materials or equipment to ultimately fulfill and build whatever it is that you're building. And then also what you'll see here is tracking your actual costs to date, right? And this is important, not only tracking it by, cost to date, but also on a periodic basis. And then MJC8 allows you to ultimately override your actual cost, because your cost can come from different areas of the platform, whether that be vendor bills, whether that be time entries, whether that be payroll. Ultimately, these costs are going to be aggregated and pulled in to give you your costs incurred to date and ultimately calculate your percent complete. So what we're seeing here is more at the project level, very summarized level of revenue and costs at the project level. But we also enable you to do periodic job costing at the monthly level. And so what you're seeing here is my revenue and cost inputs. So you can see here, right, broken down at the periodic level. So this project started sometime in August 2023 and expected end date of March 2024. So now we can sort of read this as its own little story, understanding when we actually signed that contract, when change orders occurred for that contract, what have we currently billed to date for this given project. Based off of that information, what percentage have we billed based off of our contract value, right? And we're seeing that aggregated in cumulative value as the project progresses. And again, that is just the revenue side, but we can also extremely get into detail or get into extreme detail when it comes to the cost side, right? And again, this is the more critical piece that I found when talking with prospects and customers, because this is ultimately going to drive how they're reporting, for GAAP financials and project financials, but also for how they're going to be ultimately billing in some scenarios. So what we can see here again, they have an estimated cost for the month of September of $186,000, and then approved cost changes throughout that project lifecycle. So maybe there was an additional scope of work. If you ever built a house, or if you've ever been sort of part of a large scope project, you understand budgets change and materials change as you're selecting them throughout the project lifecycle. So perhaps you had agreed on, for example, a specific set of windows, but for one reason or another, maybe the windows had a long lead time, and you weren't able to get the windows that you initially expected. And so you then had to put in a change order for a different spec window. So perhaps that's a reason for those change orders to occur, later on in the project. So you want to be able to track that and understand where those change orders are coming from. And then again, ultimately, you're going to want to track your actual costs. And then one important metric here is tracking your WIP. And this will tell you, are you overbilled or are you underbilled for this given project? Meaning, does your revenue outrun your costs, or are your costs outrunning your revenue? And so are you funding the project for your customer, or is the customer ultimately funding the project with their own funds, right? And so this is an important metric to keep track of and for project managers to understand, because it helps them understand sort of their cash flow for any given project. And then what we can see here, and probably the most critical piece of this all, is tracking your percent cost complete for any given project, especially if you're doing any sort of progress type based billing or AIA based billing, right? Percent complete is ultimately going to drive that. And it's going to drive that at the periodic level, the work code level, and the cost type level, because they want to understand, based off of their scope of work, what percent of work has been completed for those different scoping phases, for those different scoping requirements or project requirements, right? And there's different reports that we ultimately supply you with And so what you'll see here is just an example of a work code budget versus actual breakdown, and a cost type budget versus actual breakdown. And these are very two important elements of reporting, where you can see, again, broken out by different dimensions, in this case, broken out by work code, how are we progressing towards our original budgeted revenue and budgeted costs, right? Is our actual revenue outpacing our budgeted revenue? Great, right? We always sort of want to see green whenever we're looking at revenue. But now costs, have our committed costs outrun our budgeted costs? Why is this? Why is it for 9BA, for subcontractor type work, why has our committed costs outpaced our budgeted costs? Was there an error in estimating? Was there a change order that was input? Are we eating this cost? So that's why we didn't budget any cost for that specific work code. So these are the sort of insights you gain when you have that sort of granular level of reporting capability with NetSuite. It's keeping a pulse on your different revenue and cost inputs throughout that project lifecycle. So this is at the work code level. We often see this with specialty contractors and subcontractors. And oftentimes you'll see these work codes sometimes aligned to the CSI standard code. Oftentimes specialty contractors will have their own sort of work codes that they've built out specific and unique to their own business. But that's at the work code level. But we can also understand it at the cost type level. And so typically we'll see this more so with general contractors, where they're not breaking it down by work code by work code. They may, right, in some scenarios, but oftentimes what is more important to them is understanding how much labor, how much material ultimately is going to be going into this job. And so we can see, similar to the last report, right, we can understand our original budgeted revenue, our original budgeted costs, and understand sort of how this project is progressing, and be alerted and emailed if certain thresholds were surpassed, right? So we can see here again, for this specific cost type, our committed costs have outpaced our budgeted costs. We want to be able to notify and allow our project managers to be proactive and less reactive as they're going throughout that project lifecycle. And that's one of the benefits of NetSuite, is you can build those alerts within these reports to notify the right users so that they can then understand what is the underlying reason for this specific use case. Okay. And so that's some of the reporting capabilities that ultimately comes with some of our job costing standard package. Another thing I just want to sort of highlight here is, in some questions that you may be asking is, well, how does this data ultimately feed to these reports, right? And what Appficiency has done that has allowed us to be able to scale this platform and scale the solutions that we ultimately build is it's connecting directly to all of the great features that NetSuite has and all of the standard records that we typically use and often use within NetSuite. And so when it comes to your budgets, right, and that sort of revenue and cost input entry point, we're using standard NetSuite transactional records. And so oftentimes you'll see estimates and sales orders being that entry point. And so what you can see here is I have a sales order for Habitat Agency, a Pacheco Creek restoration project. I've tied this to a project record in NetSuite. And oftentimes what you'll see is NetSuite connected to an upfront project management tool, because you sort of have two parts of a project. You have your project operations and your project management, which oftentimes you'll see systems like Procore, like an Autodesk or a ProEst, or maybe some industry-specific estimating or CAD tool that's used to ultimately build their estimates. And we can certainly integrate to those systems. We've actually built our own Procore to NetSuite integration that allows you to sync your project management features in those tools directly into NetSuite, right? But another option, especially for lower volume type customers who may have, a handful or a few dozen projects a year, you can import your budgets directly from a CSV file. And that's what I did here. And so we can see, we can break down these estimates or these budgets at different levels, again, depending on the requirements of the customer, right? Again, we see that common theme, work codes, we see the cost types. We can also break it down by item. But again, depending on the type of customer that we're working with, the item doesn't matter as much. And this is why we speak to the itemless revolution, because if you've been on NetSuite long enough, you know that an item is required on every single transaction in NetSuite. But if you've worked in construction, if you've worked on projects, sometimes you don't know exactly what item is going to be used until later on in the process, right? And so we call it sort of like a TBD item, right? You know you're going to need specific doors or specific windows when you're building a house, but you don't know exactly which ones, for example. But you still need to capture the respective revenue billing amounts that you expect to charge to your customer, and you still need to track your estimated cost for that specific window, again, to set that baseline to be able then to understand, was your estimating on point or was your estimating a bit off? Why was that, right? And you can track that at different levels, whether that be the work code level, like we see here, or the different cost type levels, okay? And so, this is just an example of how we can get your budgets into the system and then mapped to the projects, again, so you can see from a high level, what your baseline budgets were for any given project, right? And then you can run those different reports that we sort of walk through to understand across multiple different projects, what that looks like line by line.